Hello, my name is Jordan Chin, and I'm an independent game composer and sound designer. Before we get started, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everybody at Game Dev Camp for having me. I know that things are a little bit different this year, and I hope that everybody is staying safe and healthy. But it's really an honor to be a part of this year's event. So, a little bit about myself, a little bit of background. I've been working in the game industry for about 8 years now. But I've been into music for as long as I can remember. I started with piano as a kid, classical piano, and as many classical pianists do, I think I felt the need to kind of rebel a little bit. So I started playing drums in metal bands. And this is a photo of my high school band, Metanoia, playing a power metal song called Hildreth, Lord of Fire. It's kind of a funny story, and I promise it's relevant. We had a friend named Taylor Hildreth, this guy here, who we just thought had the most epic name ever, like something out of Lord of the Rings. And we always said, Taylor, one of these days we're going to play a power metal epic for you, and it'll be silly and it'll be fun. And we finally did it. And so that's me smashing my drums, wearing a Viking helmet and a sword. And it's kind of funny, what started as a kind of a huge inside joke somehow became our favorite song to play. And I think it's at that moment that I realized that I really like playing and writing music for something as opposed to just sort of for the sake of it. Having a story, having a narrative, as corny as this one was, it really got me thinking how powerful music can be as a storytelling device. So after that, we stopped playing music, but I was learning guitar and began working as a singer-songwriter, writing my own lyrics, my own songs, my own stories. And now I'm composing for games full-time, telling my stories that way. So what is game audio? It's a concept that gets thrown around a lot, and I thought maybe it'd be helpful just to kind of talk about what it means to me really briefly. Game audio is music, it is sound effects, it's voiceover work, all of the assets that go into your game kind of working in tandem to create this complete audio experience for your players. And on one hand, that's correct, but see, that's also correct for film and for television. So what is it that makes game audio unique from other media out there? I think the other side to this coin, and kind of the other half of game audio, is the implementation, the execution of that audio. How and when does your music play in a game, and when exactly, like what frame of an animation will your laser gun sound effect fire? A couple of things worth mentioning on this front. Games are non-linear, so unlike film where all the music and the sounds are entering and exiting at the same time every time, games don't work in a linear fashion. So even in so-called linear games, your player actually has a lot more control over their experience than they would if they were watching a film. Because games are a medium that affords the player more control, we as developers kind of need to work around the lack of control that we have over that player experience. So let's say, for example, you have a field full of enemies and you're trying to get through it. A cautious player may take 10 minutes stealthing around and getting through, tactically, while a more aggressive player might just run through in 10 seconds. Both of those players need to have a good time playing your game, and that's kind of our job. So I'm here to basically show you that the audio has some role in that, and how we can make better games. So throughout this, I'm going to consider kind of these two halves of game audio. There's the assets and the implementation. We'll go through some important questions to ask early on in the development cycle. My goal here is kind of just to show you how much thinking can and probably should go into the audio design, so that regardless of what your discipline is, we can find ways to more effectively talk to our audio specialists and just make better sounding games. Keep in mind that for all these considerations I'm going to bring up, there's no one-size-fits-all formula in games. There's never one right answer. Everything needs to be in the service of making your game feel stronger and the world feel more immersive. So on the asset side of things, This is the content itself. It's the music, the sound effects, the voice, all those files. Before your composer, your sound designer can even start making anything, you have to kind of consider what is the style of the genre that you want to be working in. Maybe one of the first things that I'm used to discussing is your game an 8-bit game that needs chiptune music, or is it something more realistic? The lore and the world of your game, the next consideration, perhaps my favorite part of working in games, is asking how does the lore of your game kind of inform the audio? Are you in a dark and gritty world fighting demons, or are you exploring something kind of lush and beautiful? What instruments should you use in your music? And do your weapon sound effects fit the year in which your game takes place? That kind of thing. And the last thing here is use case. Is your music going to be used for combat? Is it going to be used for exploring the world map? Maybe for solving puzzles? Understanding exactly where something will play will really help your composer write something that fits. So on the implementation side of things, kind of the more technical questions that we can ask and things that we should be considering. Is your music looping? Most games nowadays do have looping music, and this helps to solve that dilemma of the person taking 10 minutes and the other person taking 10 seconds. Looping music allows both of those players to get a sense of an area without breaking their experience. But there are cases where looping music isn't needed or isn't even really wanted. And I'm going to show you one of these a little bit later. Okay, dynamic music. So with the advent of middleware software, things like Wise and Fmod, more and more games these days are opting for this kind of fluidly dynamic music experience, kind of music that is reactive to the situation. Is it kind of seamlessly ramping up when enemies draw near? Does it quiet down when a player needs to think? That kind of thing. Near Automata from this first screenshot is a really good example of a game that fluidly transitions between combat and exploration states. The audio is just so smooth that you almost don't even notice it. Take this next to a game like Pokemon, the original Game Boy Pokemon game, where when you enter a battle, there's a hard cut that will stop and they enter the next thing. Both of these are equally valid. Again, there's no one right answer. And I think that both of these games have fantastic audio for them. The last thing I want to talk about is this concept of diegetic audio. So this is basically a concept that establishes that a piece of audio is coming from a source that exists within your world. So for example, an NPC talking or birds chirping in the distance. Maybe understanding this will help your sound designer say, well, that NPC should sound like he's right in your face, but the birds chirping could be a little bit further away and a little more distant. If a sound is non-diegetic, it's something that plays but isn't presumed to be emitted from anything in your world. So menu sounds, UI things, that kind of stuff. So this is just a few of many considerations. But given all of this, the one thing I would really suggest to everyone here is to just get started early. Good audio design takes time, and I would just encourage you to bring in your audio person early and initiate these conversations. The sooner the better, in my opinion. Okay, so now I want to take you through 3 very different examples of some games that I've worked on, just to sort of show how I've put these considerations into practice. The first is this game called Monster Train, which was released earlier this year by Shiny Shu. Monster Train is a roguelike deck builder tower defense game in which you're playing a series of battles, repeating your run over and over, each time building a new deck of cards, casting creatures and spells, trying to protect your pyre, which is kind of like your health. The theme here is this heaven and hell concept, loosely based on Dante's Inferno, in which there are 9 different rings of hell, each with their own concept and their own aesthetic. And you're trying to drive your pyre on this train, this moving train, down through the 9 rings of hell and relight the center of hell. Big plot twist, you're the bad guys. So The angels are your enemies here. They've frozen over hell, and you're trying to sort of reclaim your home. So knowing this theme early on, I worked with our lore master, our kind of designer and writer, early on to establish the genre of music that we wanted. And after lots of Spotify playlisting and discussion, we decided that there should be a blend of orchestral music, something big and bombastic, with a little bit of darkness or edginess. And the edginess comes from my background as a metal musician. So there's going to be a lot of kind of down-tuned guitars and drum sets and things like that, since you are the monsters of hell after all. And at quieter moments, I was thinking kind of a more desolate, barren, Mad Max Western vibe really fit this interpretation of hell. So from there, starting with the orchestra, we kind of shortlisted some instruments that we knew we wanted across the entire soundtrack, just to create a bit of cohesion. Ultimately, we decided on choirs, both children's choirs and full adult choirs, metal guitars, acoustic guitars, dulcimer, and these huge, huge war drums. All of this to be written in a way that was kind of action-packed, with a twinge of melancholy and sorrow, and at the same time just sort of full of wonder and excitement. All the while thinking about how we can reinforce the lore with the audio and vice versa. So I mentioned before that there are 9 rings of hell in Monster Train, each with their own aesthetic and their own kind of clan or tribe of creatures. We decided to have 9 different battle tracks, each one corresponding to one of the 9 rings. For the sound effects and the voice, every one of the monsters in this game belongs to a clan, and every clan hails from one of those 9 rings. So, and here's a few examples of them. Having the kind of environment, artwork, the concept, and the creatures, the whole cast of creatures, really helped to give me a complete picture with which I could kind of think about the music, the sound, and the voice as like a complete set. This is something that I think will be easier to show you, so I prepared a small video showcasing 3 of our clans. These 3 that you see here, the Hellhorned, the Awoken, and the Stygian Guard. And what you'll hear are kind of each clan's respective theme song, as well as some of the creature sounds that go with them. Cool. So, yeah, I really have to say, like, just from this experience, it was really helpful to have the lore fleshed out, manifested into art, and just ready to go for my writing process. And it also helped us to provide a lot of direction for our voiceover artists, kind of being able to show them what the creatures look like that they would be voicing. I can't really stress enough how beneficial it is to have your audio team working early. Let's talk a little bit about the implementation of the music. So looping music, pretty straightforward. All of our music, well, most of our music is battle tracks. So we didn't want the intensity to ever drop. We kind of decided to go with something that was looping. We have a kind of random playlist. I I guess, feature in the game, where Monster Train is a series of 8 different battles. And so to keep it fresh, we decided to put the battle tracks on this randomized system where, with the exception of bosses, which have their own tracks, every battle that you fight gets one random track, kind of a pick of the hat. And so mainly we did this to keep the experience varied and fresh, but also just to allow people to feel the full extent of this world, the full extent of the soundtrack, regardless of which clan that they were playing as. Monster Train does have a very kind of simple dynamic music system in it. So in Monster Train battles, you defend against waves of enemies that are entering your train, and the last wave of every battle is a boss. So we thought, wouldn't it be cool if we had sort of this basic, bass intensity version of the music, but as soon as the boss came out, it suddenly felt more dangerous, and it stayed that way until one of you died. So every track that I wrote for this game has kind of a bass intensity version and a boss version of it. I'm going to show you real quick how that looks and sounds in game. What you will see here is a player on the turn right before the boss enters. He's going to end the turn and then begin a new turn in which the boss enters, and the music will kind of crossfade into the higher intensity version. Cool. So actually, I don't know how well that's coming through. When I was testing this earlier, there was a little bit of lag. Hopefully it came through okay. But if anybody wants to see the clips or wants a copy of the files afterwards, I'm happy to share them. Just hit me up after the talk. So yeah, basically just like a very little nudge to make you realize that once the boss enters, you're in more danger than you previously were. A really simple but I think effective way to implement that dynamic audio system. So now I want to take you on an entirely different journey. This is an upcoming game called Zenith in development with a company called Ramen VR. The game is not out yet, but we are working very hard on it right now. Zenith is a VR MMO JRPG. And in case you're like me and acronyms are really hard, it's basically a massively multiplayer online Japanese role-playing game in development for virtual reality. So it's a VR game made to support lots and lots of players in the world, kind of running around, exploring, leveling up, and bonding with other players, that kind of thing. So in the game, the lore, the world of the game, players will find themselves in a cycle of regeneration after a great calamity has swept the world, leaving only a small portion of civilization left. It is set in the future, so there are some very clear sci-fi elements to it, as well as more traditional themes of magic and creatures. Some other themes in the game are regrowth, exploration, freedom, and danger. So onto the kind of the first half of the game audio, the asset side of things. What I really want to focus on for this one is all the thinking that has gone into the music so far. As I mentioned, the game's world is a mix of traditional JRPG elements inspired by works like Studio Ghibli, Final Fantasy, various anime. But there's also this very clear futuristic bent to it. And so we want the music to feel like a hybrid of traditional orchestra with hints of sci-fi. Next up was to kind of narrow down the list of instruments that we wanted in the palette. This soundtrack goes through a lot of different regions, so it'll be pretty diverse. But we did want a strong presence from the orchestra, piano, acoustic guitars, bells, and synth elements. We felt like this combination together really helped provide a feeling of hopefulness and magic throughout the world. So something I've been really enjoying a lot about working on Zenith is the team's decision to use musical motifs and our commitment to that. We decided to release a main theme as early as possible. Again, the game is not out, but we had gone through Kickstarter and various other phases, and we wanted to release the main theme as soon as we could and sort of branch everything out from that. So what do I mean by musical motif? This is basically an element in your music, be it a melodic phrase or some kind of recurring pattern that holds special significance in the track. And as such, it can be repeated, it can be borrowed, otherwise repurposed to create some cohesion in your soundtrack. In this case, there's a melodic line in the main theme that I'm going to show you that we've been sort of weaving in and out of other tracks in various styles and applications to try and create something that feels familiar. So this is the motif in the main theme, kind of in its original form. It'll be sort of this piano thing. So that's kind of the original main theme that we released, that sort of rising piano line. And since then, we've repurposed that very simple melodic line into a few different things. The first that we did quite shortly after we released this was a pop song called Not Afraid. It was kind of just meant to be a standalone single to further elaborate on the lore of the world with some lyrics. We used it in a cinematic kind of Marvel-style trailer for our alpha. And lastly, we used it in kind of a more electronica synthwave kind of application. So I'll play those for you right now. All right, so yeah, the goal here really was just to kind of create something that felt familiar to people, and we wanted them to kind of begin to associate that very simple musical motif with the title of the game. This is something that I feel like is a really powerful tool, is creating a sonic identity for your game, so that when people hear it, they think of the game. The game is not out yet, but when players jump in and they hear the music for the first time, we hope that they feel right at home. So let's move on to the implementation, kind of the other half of this. One thing I want to bring out is if you're planning to develop a game for VR, there's some things that are done a little bit differently. So if you're working with Oculus, for example, there is an audio spatialization tool that kind of places sound effects in specific spots around the world. Typically, your sound designer will send you sound effects in stereo, that is, mixed for left and right channels. So if you're listening on headphones or on speakers, there's usually two, a left and a right. In VR, though, you usually work with mono sound effects. So your left and your right channels will be exactly the same, but you allow the spatialization to kind of do the math and tell you how your ears should hear it, so that you understand that that sound is playing from over there or over there. I'll auto sound effects. So for this kind of dynamic music idea, we're experimenting with a dynamic music system that sort of makes use of both the fluid crossfading thing I talked about from Nier, as well as the hard stop kind of Pokemon style example I gave earlier. So as players shift between, or they're in the world, they'll shift between sort of safe and unsafe versions of the level theme. But when they actually initiate combat, they trigger an enemy, it'll cut to something entirely different. So we're experimenting with kind of having a hybrid of that to see how that feels. Cool. So this last example is a very different game from the last two, a really rich world. King Under the Mountain is a game in development by Rocket Jump Technology. It's currently in alpha with a lot more features to come. So the game is a settlement building strategy game set in a fantasy world. So between sort of dwarves, humans, orcs, a variety of other races, you'll be building from scratch a sustainable, flourishing society by gathering resources, like literally carving out places to live inside of the mountains, everything down to planting crops to brewing beer. And the interesting thing about this game is how deep the simulation aspects go. So everything is occurring in real time. You're going to have to deal with surviving season cycles and natural disasters and things like that. You'll be responsible for monitoring the health of each and every one of your settlers. And by the way, they all have names. So if one of them dies, you feel extra bad. Eventually, the game will have other, kind of combat and exploration sort of adventure features as well, where you can actually take over other players' settlements, like real people. So there is this sort of world and community that will exist outside of the world of the game as well. So knowing all of this, I worked really closely with the lead developer to try and hone in on what the music of King Under the Mountain should sound like. We ended up going with something that was at the base kind of orchestral, but with Celtic and medieval inspirations, leaning into a sort of Tolkien-esque fantasy aesthetic, but experimenting with other elements like pianos and pads and various other stringed instruments. We wanted the music during the building phases to be calming, inspiring, sort of inspire you to create, and peaceful, but to feel a little bit more dangerous during like the harsh winters and the combat cycles. Sound effects are largely diegetic, so they come from a variety of sources and actions, tasks that you are giving your settlers to do, things like blacksmithing or planting crops, that sort of thing. But because there are so many different things that could be happening on a screen at any given point, I was really thinking hard about the best way to approach the sound effects and thought it's probably best that they were as short as possible. So kind of just to the point, to avoid this sort of cacophony of having lots of different things that can be going on in any given screen. If they dragged on for too long, you kind of risk losing the association between what you're seeing and what you're hearing. So shorter was better in this case. And secondly, they needed to be kind of literal. In a strategy game like this, you almost want the sounds to be kind of like little caricatures of themselves and try and convey as much key information as possible in a short period of time. So let's talk about how the audio is implemented in this game. Remember early on when I said that not all game music needs to loop? So King Under the Mountain has this sort of jukebox system, which plays through a series, like a playlist of tracks on shuffle, basically. So in other words, a track will play, it will end, there will be a brief pause, and then the next track will play. I think this is a really nice solution for strategy games in particular because of the way that they're paced. So a lull in the game experience, a lull in the music will not really distract from the task at hand. And a game where you're actually thinking and planning deeply like this, it may even be a welcome break, a nice like kind of palate cleanser. So there were a couple of benefits that I realized to having a music system like this after working on it. First thing is you have a lot of variety and a lot of flexibility with if you're not confined to having a single looping piece of music, you really can actually explore a lot of different ranges and feelings. And so there's a nice handful of tracks right now that all sort of flavor the settlement building experience in different ways. And it's nice to be able to have that variety. Secondly, I realized that as a composer, it really freed me up to write music with a proper intro and a proper ending, rather than having to think about how the music will loop back into itself. So there are pros and cons to both approaches. The next thing I really wanted to talk about was the way that the sound effects and all those diegetic sounds that I mentioned are implemented. So King Under the Mountain is designed so that the proximity to the source of the audio actually affects how you hear it. It's sort of the ultimate example of what you see is what you get. So in King Under the Mountain, you're sort of this omniscient being looking from the top down and issuing orders to your settlers. With that view in mind, you can zoom in and you can zoom out. So the interesting thing is that if you zoom in and you're really close to a settler, say, blacksmithing or something, you can hear those sounds much more clearly, but pull back a bit. And the other diegetic sources, things like winds rustling through the trees or birds chirping, stuff that you might not necessarily see, but conceptually you can understand that they're there, become more prominent. Just a small way to really kind of push the immersion to the next level. And also just to reinforce the idea that while the audio itself is important, the way in which it's used is equally important. Back to this idea again of two halves of game audio, your assets and your implementation. So this takes me to the end of things. I really hope that you found something helpful here, and really just a huge thank you for tuning in. Thank you for coming to Game Dev Camp. It's really just awesome that this event was able to go on. If there is anything here that I can clarify further, please do reach out, get in contact. Let me know if you have any thoughts or questions about the whole thing. I'd be happy to send you materials and just get in touch. My contact info is here. That's a QR link to my website, but I can also be reached on Twitter and by email. But for now, I think I'll open things up to Q&A any time that we've got left. And yeah, just thank you. I'll see you guys around.